it's been interesting kind of seeing the Switch 2 dominate the gaming discussion over the past couple of weeks. We don't know anything about this console yet, and we're already seeing a number of major copes kind of fall apart. People who said the Steam Deck was going to outperform it got utterly BTFO by the revelation that the Steam Deck has been failing and that the Valve Steam charts are confirmed fake and unreliable, right? The numbers that Valve have been implying the Steam Deck have been selling are all completely fake, and the console is not relevant. It's not competitive. Switch utterly demolishes it in every single way, shape, and form. It was never a viable thing. People are coping about PC gaming, Xbox, PlayStation, handheld gaming PCs, tablets, doing everything they possibly can to ignore the reality that not only is Switch 2 gonna be a phenomenal success right out of the gate, Switch 1 isn't going anywhere. This is a console that is going to continue to be supported for several years to come, okay? That 150 million install base isn't going anywhere. Switch 1 games are going to continue to be sold. A lot of them are going to be played on Switch 2s, and the console itself is going to be floating around for decades, okay? This is the iconic Nintendo platform of the modern era. The Switch isn't going anywhere, is kind of my big takeaway in regards to this situation. And people love to cope about this. They love to say things like, oh, well, maybe people won't adopt the Switch 2, but they will. They will. But the thing about this is, though, the thing about, the oncoming onslaught of Nintendo domination, the thing that happens every single console generation, right? Every single time we see a new one of these things coming out, you have these fake leakers, you have, those guys on Reset Era, NeoGAF, the YouTube leak community, you have these parasites crawling out of the woodwork, doing their thing of just, the third parties are going to come out, they're going to come out swinging, they're going to be putting out all these games on Switch 2 day one. No. Absolutely not. The third parties are going to do the thing they always do, where they port five-year-old games on Nintendo Switch 2 for the first year or so, use those releases as copes to their shareholders as to why they cannot support Nintendo Switch, and then proceed to put the real support behind PlayStation, Xbox, and PC. This is what happens every single console generation. With N64, with GameCube, with Wii U, Switch, right? Every single time they find some kind of excuse not to support the Nintendo console, right? Whether it's whether they claim it's about the power or about the install base or about cartridges versus discs or about the control scheme, about more mature audiences, the long and short of it is that third parties cannot afford to support Nintendo consoles because they know the instant that the majority of gamers begin to realize just how much better Nintendo is in the competition, their entire business model goes up in smoke. The instant that people realize that Nintendo is better, companies like, Microsoft, like Bungie, Bethesda, are going to get utterly blown the fuck out because they can't compete. In software, it's been what? It's taken them a decade to put out 3 mediocre Doom games, right? Not including all the other stuff they've made, the really terrible Wolfenstein thing and Prey and stuff like that. It's taken them a decade to work on Doom. Okay? What have we gotten in the Zelda IP? Alone we got Breath of the Wild, Link's Awakening, Echoes of Wisdom, Tears of the Kingdom, all of which are way better games than Doom. And that's just one Nintendo IP. And that's just one example. The reality of the situation is all the third parties have going for them is the illusion that they produce the most cutting edge games on the most powerful piece of hardware, which is not and never has been true. Just look at Ocarina of Time versus Metal Gear Solid, but that's been the cope. they've always found new ways to innovate on like fooling people into thinking that their games are the most sophisticated on the market. But the cracks have been starting to show for over a decade now, ever since the Wii U hit the scene, and people began to realize that like, wow. Donkey Kong Country Tropical Freeze is actually a really good game. Nintendo Land is actually a really good game. Star Fox Zero is actually a really good game. The narrative from game journalists that all of these games were complete and utter failures simply didn't match up with reality. And meanwhile, the games that they did try to push up, games like Dragon Age Inquisition, The Last of Us, Bioshock Infinite, it all has like completely collapsed to the point where absolutely no Western gaming legends are still relevant today. Right now, the industry is begging for Grand Theft Auto 6 to revitalize life onto the PlayStation and Xbox, when they could easily just make all of their money back by simply putting their massive backlogs of titles on Nintendo Switch. And again, where is the support for Nintendo Switch 2? Like, where are these companies? Are they making statements about how excited they are to work for Nintendo, about how they're going to develop new exciting software for it, how they're going to take advantage of all the new technology, and how they know that Nintendo is here to stay and dominate the console industry? Are they pledging their support for Nintendo Switch 2 now? And the answer is no. Every single time it's the same story. They refuse to commit. They refuse to put any support on Nintendo hardware at all. And it is high time that we, the gaming community, start addressing the actual issue, in that these inferior developers know they cannot compete with Nintendo on their own hardware, which is why they're extremely desperate to stop Zelda and Skyrim being on the same console. Because if you play both, you realize that Zelda is superior. If you play Mario and Astrobot, you'll realize that Mario is superior. If you compare Metroid to Dead Space, you find on the Nintendo side, you get one of the most innovative, fresh, original sci-fi properties in gaming, and then EA makes Dead Space, Like, Dead Space didn't even last like a single entry. It didn't even last like 5 years, if you really think about it. Mass Effect didn't last 5 years. And meanwhile, like, Mario is like reaching its, Donkey Kong started with, this is 2025, 40 years of Super Mario Bros. 45 if you include Donkey Kong. But like, this is the reality of gaming, right? This has been the real driving force behind the console war, in that the Western video game world does not want to admit that they have never been competitive with Nintendo consoles or their software in any way, shape, or form. And this is going to be another major blow against them, because I believe the third parties desperately believe that once the Switch's luster wore off, and once it stopped being like a talked about console, it would just fade away. But that just isn't happening. The reality is people buy and play new games on this thing all the time, while their PS5s and Xbox Series X's collect dust. Like, this is the reality of the situation, is that third parties are going to try and pull the same trick that they did with the Switch, but it just isn't going to fly anymore. Especially now that people are starting to realize that the whole power argument doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, considering so many like current gen games run on Nintendo Switch just fine, and the Switch 2, when it gets like games that are more extensive and bigger than the major third-party titles, it's going to be very hard to gaslight people into thinking that Baldur's Gate 3 couldn't run on Nintendo Switch, Like, it just isn't going to be possible. And more people are starting to realize that. But how much longer is it going to go on? How much longer until people start refusing to support PlayStation, Xbox, and PC, and start demanding third parties to only support Nintendo hardware? Right? It still feels a long way away. People are becoming disenchanted with Xbox, PlayStation, and PC, but they have been trained to hate Nintendo so much that like a lot of them will never even consider supporting the console. And it's going to be a really interesting thing to see just how Nintendo proceeds with these kind of situations. And but But I do think the path forward is clear, is just continue supporting Nintendo Switch, put out the Nintendo Switch 2, make it a huge hit, and eventually people are going to realize that Nintendo is on top of the gaming world. And there is nothing that the third parties can do to stop it.